then after we have our Volume 1 approved and our Volume 2 submitted, like I said, we'll do the BEAD challenge process. NTIA is indicating that they will approve the Volume 1s first and then the Volume 2s, and they're telling us they hope to have all of those approved by March of 2024. Once a state or eligible entity's Volume 2 is approved, that's when the 365-day clock starts. And during that 365-day period, you're supposed to select all of the subgrantees that would build out broadband to those un- and underserved or priority 1 and 2 locations, and submit under the schedule NTIA is indicating that would be March of 2025. The timeline then is that projects are to be completed within 4 years after the final proposal is approved by NTIA and contracts have been fully executed. And so we are anticipating those contracts would be fully executed likely the second half of 2025, and that's assuming NTIA meets its approval timelines. And that would mean 4 years would expire, or the construction should complete by late 2029. Now, the eligible entity, which are the state or the 6 territories, they can extend that 4-year deadline up to 1 year with approval by NTIA if there is a specific plan for use of the funds and a specific end date less than a year out, where construction is already underway or there has been extenuating circumstances that require the extension to complete construction. So that could mean by the end of 2030, the BEAD construction should be completed. So it's a long process. And if you recall, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed by President Biden in November of 2021. So we're already 2 years into the program. Next slide. This is the timeline that we had included in our 5-year action plan that was submitted, like I said, in July of 2023. I think maybe it's a little bit more realistic, but it does show that we do anticipate or hope to complete 3 grant rounds to select our subgrantees in that 365-day period. So you can see that top green box is when our digital equity plan was submitted, so that is still pending curing and approval. The initial proposal, like I said, is due December 27th of 2023. We're hoping the challenge process then, if we have our Volume 1 approved, we can conduct that challenge process, at least starting it in the first quarter of 2024. Here we're anticipating that NTIA will have finished the approvals of the initial proposal, Volume 1 and 2, by July of 2024. And that would put our first grant round to select subgrantees in about September 2024, our second one in January of 2025, the third grant round May of 2025, submit the final proposal to NTIA July of 2025, then some time for NTIA to approve the final proposal. So while the initial proposal kind of lays out how we're going to select the subgrantees, the final proposal includes all of the subgrantees that the state has selected, the locations that they're going to build to, and how much of that $652 million they're going to receive to do that construction. So once that goes to NTIA, which on this slide shows it to be July of 2025, NTIA has to approve all of that. And then if you assume they'll take a few months to do that, that would be October of 2025. And so contracts executed late December of 2025. And then construction in spring of 26. Given Minnesota's winter months where not much can happen, this to us seems a little bit more realistic. But you know, a lot of that is out of our control. It really does depend on how long it takes NTIA to turn around some of the stuff after we submit and cure, and how long that process takes. But so that's kind of the framework. And I think the next slide we start looking at the issues that are in each of the volumes. All right, so for BEAD, the NTIA broke out the issues. There are 20 requirements in the BEAD Notice of Funding Opportunity. Volume 1 includes the requirements number 3, 5, 6, and 7. Requirement number 3 is a list of existing broadband funding. So for example, that's the border-to-border funding that we've put out over the last 10 years in, well, 9 rounds, counting the one due this week. Capital projects funding, those were ARPA CPF rounds that we awarded in December of 22 and June of 23. ARDA funding, which was awarded by the FCC. Reconnect, which is a U.S. Department of Ag program. HUD funding, which our Small Cities group rolled out some CDBG funds for broadband. Community Connect, which is another U.S. Department of Ag program. And then I know there was some congressionally delegated or directed spending, and there's been private investment. Requirement 5 is the location IDs for all unserved and underserved locations. So, you know, every location generally has an address and a latitude and a longitude, and now it also has a location ID from the fabric that the FCC developed in conjunction with its vendor CostQuest. Requirement 6 is the definition and location of all community anchor institutions. And then requirement 7 is that BEAD challenge process that we're hoping to open in the first quarter of 24. So I'll go through each of those a little bit more. Next slide. This slide just was taken pretty much from our 5-year action plan, and it lists the different funding that has been awarded or is in line to be awarded for broadband infrastructure. And so the intent here is, it's not my favorite word, but NTIA has a word, and it is actually a word, it's deduplicate. And what we don't want to have happen is, you know, one source of government funding being used to build infrastructure, fiber, or fast broadband to a location, and then another funding program administered by a different entity awards money to the same, you know, to build to the same location. So that's the deduplication. And so we're going to be looking at the existing broadband funding and where we haven't, converting those locations to that broadband fabric ID number and trying to make sure we don't put BEAD funding on top of locations that received other funding. And this is the list of some of that other funding we've identified. Next slide. All right, so this is a requirement that we submit two basically data files, one file that lists all of the unserved locations and one file that lists all of the underserved locations, and they're drawn from the most recent FCC National Broadband Map. And those would be the locations that if they're unserved, they don't have a reliable broadband service of at least 25 by 3. And if they're underserved, they reportedly have 25 by 3, but don't have service at or above 100 by 20. And that would be the basis for that challenge process. So I know some folks have been waiting for us to identify the locations, but really we need to do that closer to when we'd open up the challenge process to make it as accurate a list as possible and get more of that deduplication out of the way. Next slide. All right, based on the FCC maps as we've seen them, this map shows Minnesota. I think you can see the outline, the counties are outlined in white, and then you can see the outline of the state. The green areas reportedly have a reliable broadband service, and then the red areas would be those eligible for BEAD funding, and the orange areas would be the underserved locations. And again, this is a few months old, and we'll go through the challenge process to validate whether that is correct or not. And it's also high level, so you know when you zoom in, it might look a little bit different for specific locations. But I just wanted to show folks that you know there is a difference if you look at our map versus the BEAD eligibility map as to what the FCC and NTIA definitions show as being eligible for this funding. Next slide. All right, so for the community anchor requirement 6, we were to define what's all included for community anchors. We have previously identified community anchor institutions going back to the old America Recovery and Reinvestment Act funding back in 2010, where we had to have a community anchor institution layer on. And so we have locations for that data set. Plus, we have data that we recently received from the Minnesota Township Association to put all the township halls on the map. And so if a community anchor hasn't previously been identified in our data set, we're hoping that those folks working with those community anchors can let us know, and then we can add it on. We did not put a huge additional effort into identifying the community anchor institutions for two reasons. One is because we've had them on our map for 10 years, so if folks felt they weren't represented there, they could let us know. And two, because we're not going to have funding available to bring gigabit broadband speeds to community anchors, we were told by NTIA just to put in the requisite amount of work to come up with a layer, since it's not going to be impacted by the BEAD funding. Next slide. All right, requirement 7 is the BEAD challenge process, and Minnesota has indicated in its volume 1 that it will adopt the NTIA BEAD module challenge process. We will also adopt an optional module 2 that NTIA provided, which would treat all locations that have qualifying broadband service delivered via DSL or digital subscriber line service, which is the telephone network copper, as underserved. We are also indicating that we would adopt the NTIA optional module 3 that will treat as underserved or unserved those locations that demonstrate through the BEAD model challenge process speed test module that served locations, or those locations identified as served, actually don't receive service as purported, that if they're materially below 100 megabit download and 20 megabit upload, or below 25 megabit down and 3 megabit upload, that they'll be categorized as underserved or unserved. We have also proposed a fixed wireless modification that would define unserved and underserved locations as those lacking a wired broadband service, unless a fixed wireless provider can document via the challenge process that they can in fact provide reliable broadband service. And actually here I should say we have two fixed wireless modifications. First, we would like to just keep the BEAD program the same as our state law, which is that you have to have a wired broadband service. I suspect the NTIA isn't going to allow us to do that because it would change the definition of a reliable broadband service from what's in the BEAD NOFO. So then our second plan B, I guess, would be if we would have a fixed wireless modification so that it puts the burden of proof back on the fixed wireless provider, that if we blanket say those locations are underserved or unserved, then the fixed wireless provider could challenge and indicate to us where they could actually serve at 100 by 20 or 25 by 3, so that those locations, if they really have fixed wireless service, wouldn't be eligible for BEAD funding. Right now what we have is a lot of fixed wireless locations that we know really don't have the service, and if it's licensed spectrum, they currently aren't eligible unless we go through this challenge process with the end user customer trying to document it and then roll it up so that a local government or nonprofit can do an official challenge of those locations. So, but what the DIA says as they review our initial proposal. Next slide. I think I've probably gone through a lot of this, but we are going to use a vendor for the portal to submit challenges and supporting documentations, and individuals will be able to submit information into the portal, but as NTIA has required, official challenges can only be filed by local or tribal governments, nonprofits, and broadband service providers. And then the Office of Broadband is the one that will go through these challenges, and then if it's like a challenge that a nonprofit or a local government files, then the provider has the chance to file documentation challenging that it really is served, and the Office of Broadband would go through and adjudicate those challenges. Challenges can be based on availability, speed, latency, if there's an unreasonable data cap, if the technology cited is wrong, if it's really a business service only and it's not available for residential service, if there's an enforceable commitment in place to serve, if a provider has plans to serve. On the flip side, if it's not part of an enforceable commitment, then it would be eligible. If it is or isn't a community anchor institution. And then we'll also accept multiple dwelling unit challenges. We know there are some issues with apartment buildings that maybe show to have service but don't. And so again, using the NTIA guidelines, it has to be 3 units or 10% of the unit count, whichever is larger, submitting a challenge before we could consider it. So there'll be 30 days for official challenges to be submitted, 30 days for rebuttal, and then we will adjudicate and make our determination within 30 days of the challenge rebuttal. And then NTIA, under schedule or a listing I saw, they have the ability, they will make a final determination, or they have to approve our final determinations. And so again, that timeline wasn't built in any schedule that I've seen, but it would be part of the volume 1 process. Next slide. All right, BEAD volume 2. This is a little bit less cut and dried. It has requirements 1, 2, 4, and 8 through 20. Requirement 1 are objectives. Requirement 2 are local, tribal, and regional broadband planning processes. 4 is local coordination. 8 is deployment subgrantee selection. 9 is non-deployment subgrantee selection, which we won't have any of in Minnesota. Eligible entity implementation activities, labor standards and protection, workforce readiness, and then the next slide has 13 through 20. Minority business enterprises, cost and barrier reduction, climate assessment, the low-cost broadband service option, the middle-class affordability plan. That's out of order, I think, just so it's under the low-cost broadband service option. And then 17 is the use of 20% funding, which is really more of an issue for DEED in the state. Eligible entity regulatory approach, and then certification of compliance with BEAD requirements. Okay. So our objectives really tie back to the goals that we have in statute, which is that all homes and businesses should have access to at least one provider offering speeds of at least 100 megabits per second down and upload speeds of at least 20 megabits per second. And then there are 3 other state broadband leadership positions. We don't talk about those as much because they are much more difficult to measure, but by 2022 and thereafter, the state was to be in the top 5 states of the U.S. for broadband speed universally accessible to residents and businesses, the top 5 states for broadband access, and the top 15 when compared to countries globally for broadband penetration. And having been involved with the original task force recommendation back in 2009, there were some measures then that made it a little bit easier to measure, but it's pretty difficult to measure those leadership positions under subdivision 2 with any existing data. Next slide. Requirement 2 are the broadband planning processes. So this goes back to a little bit of the work that's been done in Minnesota over the many years that this office has been in existence. But meetings, the office was created in statute in 2013. And again, it was one of those early broadband task force recommendations. And then meetings were held in the winter of 2013 and the 2013-14 winter to gather input on what a grant program should look like. And then that grant program was created in statute in 2014. And, since all of those meetings back in 2013, the office has a long history of meeting with stakeholders to address and discuss how to improve broadband. And you can see that list as part of our 5-year action plan. And that list, there's a list there that goes back to 2013. The volume 2 list is just the more recent BEAD stakeholder engagement. Other ways that the state has engaged in broadband planning is through the Governor's Task Force on Broadband, which has been in place since 2011. And there's been multi-stakeholder representation on that task force and a public comment period on most of the meeting agendas to hear from members of the public. The broadband program, the goals and the funding have been reviewed each legislative session and updated frequently through law changes, so the program's been kept current. We have an ongoing tribal engagement through MIAC, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, and individually with tribes through DEED's Tribal Liaison. And within the last 6 months, we've had a really strong agenda in those tribal consultations on broadband to share with the tribes what is happening with broadband and how they can have input. And then our office has, for many years, had attendance at annual association meetings, including the League of Minnesota Cities, the Association of Minnesota Counties. I think Bree was just there this morning. The Minnesota Association of Townships, our office went to, I think, almost every training session that they had earlier this year. We had someone there representing the infrastructure side of the office, talking about the BEAD funding that was coming. The Minnesota Cable Communications Association, the Minnesota Telecom Alliance, the Economic Development Association of Minnesota, the Minnesota Association of Professional County Economic Development Directors, I think is the C, and then regional economic development meetings. And so we had participation with all of those annual association meetings. And prior to the Blandin Foundation exiting the broadband space, there were many, many years we co-hosted an annual conference on broadband with Blandin. So I think it's been a pretty strong showing that this hasn't been a stagnant program, that we've been working to keep it current and to keep them, meeting the needs of folks that need broadband infrastructure, and now more recently, digital opportunity needs. The next requirement is local coordination. And again, this kind of ties back onto the prior requirement, but we have frequent speaking engagements and consultations individually and in groups. We have information on the website. I mean, our website has really grown a lot just in the last year or two. Flyers, handouts, in-person meetings, virtual meetings during the pandemic. We've put together webinars related to each grant round RFP. We have webinars on how to use our maps. We try to pride ourselves on being available via email and phone and getting back to folks. And demonstration of some of that work is in that local coordination tracker tool that's attached to Volume 2. Great. Requirement 8 is the deployment subgrantee selection. And again, Minnesota law requires that the funding be distributed through the existing border-to-border grant programs. And so in Volume 2, we point to a lot of the application material that we would use to judge the financial, technical, managerial, and operational capacity of an applicant. We follow Minnesota Department of Administration Office of Grant Management policies. BEAD will require all unserved locations receive service before underserved locations are considered. So we plan to have unserved locations be the focus of the first 2 of 3 planned grant rounds to make sure we're getting to priority 1 before we commit to priority 2 locations. And if we need to, we will directly negotiate with providers and applicants in areas adjacent to where we're not seeing a provider interested to see if we can get those unserved locations committed for build out. And then some of the states are picking the project areas and requesting applications to be submitted for the areas they select. We want to try to continue what we've successfully done with border to border, and that is to let our applicants choose the project areas that they want to serve. And so other than maybe asking if adjacent unserved locations could be included to reach all unserved locations, we're hoping that that process still works through the BEAD funding allocation. Next slide. All right, if there is no provider willing to serve some unserved locations after the 3rd planned grant round, our intent is to request in the final proposal submitted to NTIA that those locations default to existing fixed wireless or low Earth orbiting satellite service and be addressed further in any future state funding, RDOF 2, Reconnect, Community Connect, etc. grant programs. We would like to respond to the applications that we receive. Generally, those have been for fiber. We don't want to have to ratchet back how many fiber projects we have in front of us just to show that we're getting some type of internet to everyone. But again, that is not our ability to say finally, because these proposals do have to be approved by NTIA. Getting a little bit deeper into the subgrantee selection process, if an application meets all of those technical, managerial, financial, and operational requirements, so that they could, that applicant could successfully complete a project, and they are the only application for those unserved locations or underserved locations when we get to round 3, then they would be awarded the funding. We get to the scoring rubric, which comes into play if there are competing applications for the same locations. And so then we would go towards scoring on the criteria that are in the rubric, which is points based on the amount of match, points for affordability, and points for fair labor practices. And those 3 are called the primary scoring criteria, and they are mandated by NTIA's scoring process. The secondary criteria, we are required to award points for speed to deployment, and then we also added points for deploying to higher speeds, and points for that demonstration of community support, which has really been a priority in our program to date. So we're trying to continue that in the BEAD program. Next. So this is requirement 9, like I indicated when we went through the list. These are non-deployment subgrantee selections, and we will not be having any of those in Minnesota because all of our money will be going to broadband infrastructure deployment. Next slide. All right, 10, eligible entity implementation activities. So these are defined as the initiatives that the eligible entity, which is the state, will undertake without making a subgrant. And so for our office, which is overseeing the $652 million, we have the $5 million initial planning grant, and then we'll be using the rest of the funding for implementing the BEAD challenge process. That's hiring the consultant to stand up the portal. The administering the BEAD program, we're allowed to use up to 2% of the funding for administration of the program. And then we'll also be using some of the funding for our mapping and data collection and to validate after the BEAD projects are built. And the bulk of the BEAD allocation will be used, and it is intended to be used for awarding subgrants to applicants to build broadband infrastructure to those unserved and underserved locations. Next slide. Requirement 11, labor standards and protection. So applicants for BEAD grants will need to verify that they've complied with federal labor and employment laws and certify that the applicant and their subcontractors have consistently complied, certify that they have not been found to violate, I guess that there is a typo, have not been found to have violated laws such as OSHA or FLSA for the preceding 3 years. And then we do require reporting on compliance, number of employees and contractors, and the other things on this list in the contract compliance, and we'll do so for the federally BEAD funded projects as well, and as required by NTIA. For workforce readiness, requirement 12, our office is part of the deployment, the Department of Employment and Economic Development, which includes the state's workforce areas. And so we have partnered with those areas, workforce development, the governor's workforce development board, et cetera, to address broadband workforce needs holistically. We have a lot of demand on the workforce numbers in Minnesota with broadband and with the transportation and smart grid jobs. And so it makes sense to kind of have that thought about on a statewide basis rather than the Office of Broadband trying to figure out how we're going to get broadband workers. And so that's where we've been partnering. We have also been sharing information for at least the last 2 years with our associations about workforce training programs that DEED has available, like partnering with colleges to train workforce for specific types of jobs. And I haven't seen any of our companies step up wanting to use that. I know Excel Energy has on the energy side, but that is there, and they've known about that for a couple of years anyway. But I think, by looking at it with a focus at the level of the workforce area at DEED, which has the expertise, I think that's going to be more successful in addressing the workforce readiness than if we were trying to do it within our office just for broadband workers. Next slide. Requirement 13 is minority business enterprises and labor surplus area firms inclusion. And so our broadband grant template requires grantees to take all necessary steps to assure that targeted vendors with active certifications are used when possible. And we have required certifications on non-discrimination and equal opportunity that have to be signed up on the contracts. And then we would add any additional requirements by NTIA that need to be included to meet this requirement. Next. Requirement 14 is cost and barrier reduction. And so the examples for this that were included in the guidance are promoting the use of existing infrastructure, dig once policies, streamlining permitting processes, cost-effective access to poles, conduits, and easements, and streamlining rights of way. We have had on our grant application for a number of years a place for the applicants to identify whether their proposed project is leveraging existing broadband networks or will be built in conjunction with other projects. And I think I just saw a question come into our FA, on that into our DEED.broadband box yesterday or today. We've also had a dig once policy and know that MnDOT works with broadband providers to provide advance notice of their road construction projects. And then for a number of years, our office has partnered with Minnesota Business First Stop, and in 2022, a broadband subgroup of Minnesota Business First Stop was stood up to address permitting issues. And if you're a provider on the call, you're probably aware that there have been some permitting issues, and we continue to work through this, trying to get that process streamlined before this BEAD funding hits. But there have been a few little bumps in the road this year, and we're aware of them, and we're trying to address those so that we at least know the expectations when the BEAD funding comes. Requirement 15 is climate assessment. NTIA provided a list of climate resiliency resources that we reviewed and noted those findings for Minnesota. Unlike some of the coastal states, we don't seem to have any areas that are more likely to be impacted by extreme weather events than other areas of the state. I mean, there's some differences, but not drastic. And so our finding was that there's no region or group of counties at significantly greater risk than another region. This requirement is somewhat timely in that the legislature in the 2023 session just stood up an infrastructure resilience advisory task force, and our very own Bree Mackey was appointed to represent DEED on that task force. So she will be conveying issues related to broadband and BEAD requirements and learning from being on that task force and bring that work back to the office to incorporate into the BEAD program. Requirement 16 is the low-cost broadband service option. So here, what we require is that applicants provide their rates for their 100 by 20 and 100 by 100 service, and then they also need to identify any additional equipment or separately chargeable installation elements and their marketing efforts, and provide information on how their rates are affordable to the target markets. And then when we get to BEAD, we'll add some additional information on basic service characteristics that are required, like latency, data caps, any material network management practices. And then we're proposing that applicants have to commit to charge a price for their low-cost broadband option to low-income households that meet the eligibility requirements for the Affordable Connectivity Plan or its successor. They have to participate in the ACP or its successor, and they have to have a low-cost broadband option that's priced below the FCC's urban rate comparability benchmark. I know the example they provided was mandating a rate like of $30 or less. We are electing not to do that at this point. We are trying to attract as many applicants as we can to the program, and we do know that a rate of $30 would be a hardship for some of our small rural providers that don't have the business base or the urban base to cross-subsidize rates for low-income folks, which is historically how that cross-subsidization has occurred in the telecommunications industry. Next slide. BEAD also requires a middle-class affordability plan. And one of the ways we've addressed this was similar to a requirement in the capital projects funding with the American Rescue Plan Act. We feel that if there is a community that has worked to engage with a provider and have an application submitted, that community finds the service to be provided by that applicant to be of high quality and desired by the residents and at the rates that are offered by the provider. So the community has vetted the rates, in our opinion, if they want to partner with that provider. And so we believe that the community has found those rates to be affordable for their population. And then we also do the comparison of the rates to the FCC urban rate comparability benchmark. And then we have required providers to lower rates to below that benchmark in order to award them a grant. And we did that last December, and it was 5 rural co-ops that we asked to reduce their rates to receive a grant, and they did. But again, that's the FCC urban rate comparability benchmarks are, a little on the high side compared to what we see from the large national providers. So we felt we could do that in order to award a grant. And then with the ACP offering for the low income, other than that, if the provider wants to offer another low income service offering, which some do with lower rates, that's more on them, and has been the way we've run the grant program in the past. Requirement 17 is the use of that 20% funding. If you can request 0% of the funding, 20%, or up to 100% in order for the state to award and to issue an RFP to select the subgrantees, even though they're not finally approved until the final proposal is submitted. Minnesota will be requesting 100% of its BEAD funding allocation so that we can say we have the money in hand to issue that RFP. It's referred to as an anti-deficiency law. So that's just more of a mechanics kind of thing. Eligible entity regulatory approach. Requirement 18 is for the state to disclose if it will waive all laws concerning broadband that either preclude certain public sector providers from participating or impose specific requirements on public sector entities. There are a couple of laws that have been viewed as barriers to public sector provision of broadband in Minnesota. One of those is 429.021, but that law is that a municipality can't construct broadband if it's going to compete. And so if there's already a provider there, that area wouldn't be eligible for BEAD funding anyway, so that we feel that's not a barrier. And then Minnesota Statutes 237.19 is also cited as a barrier. However, it refers to telephone exchange service, and telephone exchange service is not broadband service, and so we don't think that's applicable to BEAD funding either. Next slide, certification of compliance. So this is just where the eligible entity has to certify that it intends to comply with all applicable requirements of the BEAD program. So We'll distribute the funding by a reimbursement process that's consistent with how we run the border-to-border program anyway. Inclusion of clawback provisions, we have had that in our contracts in the past few years. Timely subgrantee reporting mandates, that's a part of our Office of Grants Management requirements. And then robust subgrantee monitoring practices, again, that's part of our subgrantee monitoring under the Office of Grants Management requirements. And then there's a couple of other provisions. The eligible entity will account for and satisfy authorities relating to civil rights and non-discrimination and ensures subgrantee compliance with cybersecurity and supply chain risk management requirements. And those are check boxes that they have to commit to doing. Requirement 20 was that middle class affordability. So those are the end of the 20 requirements. We do know that there are going to be challenges to broadband deployment under the BEAD program. We have the conflicting state federal speed goals. We have the definition of broadband. We aren't guaranteed we're going to get applications for all unserved locations. We have Minnesota's weather to deal with, where everything pretty much shuts down by late October, although I think they're still burying this year at this time. And then is not usually until mid-May. The timelines, I think it's frustrating to folks to realize maybe they won't get this service that they've been hearing so much about until 2029 or 2030. Permitting issues, again, just as our office is experiencing a higher workload with this funding, we do know that the permitting entities are also seeing a higher workload, and they're not directly able to be reimbursed with the BEAD funding. Accurate mapping is an issue. Supplies and supply chain, we're waiting to see, whether things bubble up. Fiber seems to be available. Some of the component parts might, put a little monkey wrench in to schedules. Workforce, line of credit. The NTIA did back down on its line of credit requirements, so we'll see if we can run that consistent with how we've done border to border. Reporting requirements, trying to get a handle on all of the reports that are going to be required by our office, and then in turn we have reports that will be due from the subgrantees. Guidance requests clarification. The guidance is still coming out from NTIA, so that's hard to provide certainty to subgrantees or to you all if we don't have it. And I'm sure there'll be other things that come up along the way. All right, so questions. And I'm sorry, I spoke longer than I thought I would. But that's just basically the covers to our two proposals if you've gone in and looked at them online. And we can open it up and take questions now if you have. We don't guarantee we'll have all the answers. Some of these might be takebacks. You can also submit written comments on the volume 1 and or 2 in the portal. That's listed there. You can get to it on our website. You can also mail comments into the Office of Broadband Development at DEED at our, that's our new address where we've been for a year or so, but the mail office has moved over now. So, and they do need to be submitted by 4:00 on Tuesday, December 12th. So that's whether you mail them in, try to make sure they get there by then for us to consider them. And if you submit through the portal, they need to be submitted by 4:00 on Tuesday, December 12th. Any questions?
If you could please raise your hand or add your question to the chat, we will unmute you as your questions are asked.
I think Barbara had a question.
Barbara, are you able to unmute yourself?
Oh, maybe. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Our biggest question with Barbara Dare Klein, Leesburg County. volume 1 and the challenge process. So you go to page 9 and you talk about the fixed wireless providers, and the fixed wireless providers, the long quote in there about how they're putting potential customers on the map. And then the response in the next paragraph is fixed wireless providers are in the best position to provide documentation, the challenge process. It's very confusing what is going to happen with fixed wireless, and that is our whole issue in Le County in terms of eligibility for the BEAD funding. So could you clarify? Page 9 is very confusing. And could you clarify what your expectations are for the challenge process for counties? Is it going to be household by household, or can the provider be challenged and fix the map that way?
We have two proposals. Our first option is that we're requesting that fixed wireless be blanket excluded so that we can run the grant program like we run our border-to-border program. Anyone without a wired broadband service is eligible to apply. We don't expect the NTIA to approve that because in one of their guidance documents, they say you can't change the definition of reliable broadband service in the NOFO. And the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, defines reliable broadband service as a wired broadband service or service over licensed fixed wireless. So if they don't approve option 1, then our second option, and we tried to show specific examples because they won't, what they told us when they previewed this volume 1 was you can't just take national standards. But that option would put the burden of proof on the fixed wireless provider to come in. We would say anything with licensed fixed wireless is unserved or underserved. Then the fixed wireless provider could come in and challenge and tell us, I can serve all of these locations at speeds of at least 100 by 20 or 25 by 3. And then those would be considered served. I mean, if fixed wireless works, we know it works. Bree has it at her house. She doesn't cut out when we're having calls. So the issue is they're over-reporting. So they're saying it works and it doesn't work. And so what we're saying for those locations where it doesn't work, we're saying they all don't work. The fixed wireless provider would have to tell us it does work here. And then those locations would not be eligible for BEAD funding.
And then they provide some documentation as to the households they're actually serving, as opposed to could be serving some at some point in our lifetime?
Well, that they would have to be able to provide documentation, their propagation studies showing they can get service there. They can get it there within 10 days. They don't charge any excess construction fees beyond normal installation charges. And the latency, it meets the latency. So the burden of proof would be back on them. And again, we're talking about licensed or licensed by rule fixed wireless. We have a lot of fixed wireless providers out there that are on unlicensed spectrum. Those are going to be eligible for BEAD funding.
Unlicensed as well?
Unlicensed is not reliable broadband service under the NTIA's definition. So those locations are eligible for BEAD funding. The companies that are using licensed or licensed by rule fixed wireless generally are T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, Midco, Mediacom.
Yep. So let me go back and get some more clarity, please. So you say that the fixed wireless providers can provide that documentation. So what is the role of a county government in the challenge process where that provider is not adequately serving that area?
So if our fixed wireless module is adopted and the burden of proof is back on the fixed wireless provider, the county could rebut and say, no, they can't get service to these addresses. We have speed tests from customers, or and then our office would have to adjudicate. If NTIA rejects our fixed wireless modules, both of them, so that then it would be up to the citizens and businesses to go in and take the 3 speed tests like is required, and then those challenges could roll up and be submitted by a county or a nonprofit, and then the provider would have a chance to rebut, and then our office would adjudicate.
But if the provider isn't providing services to the customer, then there's no speed tests.
Correct. But
yeah.
if the resident has asked for service and they have an email saying, we can't get service to you, or the fastest we can get is 10 down, 2 up, that's the documentation to support that the provider can't serve there like they're saying they could.
And could you explain what this portal is? Is that, and how a county would submit that to the state portal as opposed to on the FCC map?
Well, we're working with an entity to develop the portal, but you would go in similar to the FCC map. You'd have to, identify your location and then have an opportunity to upload your documentation, or take the speed tests 3 different times. That's an NTIA requirement. We can't do anything about that. And then if those 3 speed tests showed service wasn't available at the speeds the provider said they were, then it would be challengeable. If you go through and read the requirements, it's in the model speed test. It's in that volume 1.
One last part. So does it help you in challenging NTIA on that issue for a lot of written documentation as to concerns about it?
Yes, if you have individual information about fixed wireless service on licensed spectrum not meeting the speed requirements, then that would help us provide Minnesota-specific data. Or if you have instances where residents were told, oh, I can't get service to you, the tree cover, the topography, or you're too far from the tower. Again, that would be Minnesota-specific information that counters the data that's showing up on the FCC map.
Thank you.
We have a comment in the chat from Gary Johnson, and his comment is, great work. Really appreciate how your thorough understanding and experience with the realities of broadband delivery has informed your proposals to NTIA. Are there any further questions or comments?
If I would just say, this is Diana, if you agree with things, you can certainly file comments supporting what we've included. That'll help demonstrate to NTIA that that is really the feelings of Minnesotans. I mean, obviously we've talked to a lot of people across the state and have, used that background and that information to put this proposal together, but it doesn't hurt to have folks tell us, yes, you got it right. And again, if you disagree with what's in there, submit comments, submit suggested ways to change it. We'd be happy to look at it. I see we have another question in the chat. Why are you allowing fixed wireless providers to challenge locations but not DSL providers? And that is actually a good question, and it's interesting. The NTIA actually did the DSL module, and their rationale was that DSL is an end-of-life technology. It's not getting better. No one is installing copper. On the flip side to that, fixed wireless technology is changing. It's getting faster, and so that's why they've allowed for fixed wireless over the licensed spectrum to be considered a reliable broadband service.
So I was just going to jump in if there aren't any other questions. You, I think, all have our contact information. A reminder, public comment ends on December 12th, and we have a really quick turnaround to finalize our plan. It is due to NTIA by December 27th. We are hoping to do it prior to the Christmas holiday. And so I just, again, want to reiterate all of the hard work that's gone into where we are right now. As Diane mentioned, we tried to mirror as best we can the existing program that we have here in Minnesota, and also the direction of the state legislature to run the BEAD dollars through this program. And so we're hopeful that with all of your partnerships, we can do the best we can with the dollars that we have. So I don't want to stop this early because we still have some time, but I also want to be respectful if we don't have additional public comments. Looks like we have a couple comments in the chat again. I'm not sure what's going on with but we will check the links. David, thank you for flagging that. And then thank you, Dave Beckett, for your comments as well. So I think I'll give it one more minute for any additional. Otherwise, please, like I said, we encourage you to make public comments, both in support and those areas you'd like to change. And a reminder, there is another one of these listening sessions tomorrow. So if somebody has on your teams or in your communities missed this and would like to join, please forward that information on to them as well. Okay, well, I think we're going to close the meeting with